Welcome to Nowhere to Hide. Today we're going to be talking about masking their true intentions. Now, the primary election has come and gone, and thankfully, there were a lot of people out there who were, how can I put this nicely, pretending to be conservative Republicans. But was that really their intention, or were they trying to game the system? I've got some details you may want to see in just a few moments.
The press club are biased all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Well, Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well, that's not how this works.
Again, welcome to Nowhere to Hide. I'm excited to talk about this from the standpoint of, the masking of their true intentions seems to be a hallmark of politics, not just in Idaho, but in many other places as well. And I want you to notice that I'm going to spend less time talking about the personality characteristics of people and making ad hominem attacks against them as wondering what their principles are, because this is really what it comes down to, is power versus principles. And isn't it interesting that the people who are most principled, or at least those legislators who have shown themselves to be most principled, not by their words, but by their actual measurable actions, the way that they have voted on various pieces of legislation, they have been pilloried as extremists, in other words, that are supposed to scare us away and make us think that they are terrible, bad people, leading us to a dark place where, what's the word? Freedom, spelled D-U-M-B, is going to prevail. So first, let's take a look at some of the good news. And these are thoughts from Ron Nate, who is president of the Idaho Freedom Foundation. He had a great article on their website about how Idaho breaks right, and the future gets brighter. Now, I won't go into all the details here. He covers a number of different policy areas, but the summary he points out here is very worth your consideration. In all, 16 Republican incumbents lost re-election bids. But look at this. 11 of those losing incumbents had scores in the F range on the Idaho Freedom Index. In other words, they weren't representing freedom all that well. So this is not necessarily a disaster in the sense that perhaps more principled Republicans are going to be able to take their place, again, assuming they get through the November election. He does point out only 3 Republicans who lost re-election had scores in the A range. That's a pretty good ratio there. I mean, it's sad we lost some good ones, but basically, Ron says Idaho has spoken. It wants freedom legislators in office to match their freedom values. Now, for that to happen, that means that as a voting public, we're going to have to be a little bit smarter about how and who we elect. I wanted you to see this comment, too, from Senator Scott Herndon, who unfortunately was defeated in his primary race. And I like the observation he makes. First of all, Senate President Pro Tem Chuck Winder's defeat is healthy in the terms of conservative change in the Senate. Winder actually blocked or otherwise thwarted a lot of conservative types of policy that could have kept government small, kept it accountable, and lowered the costs. Now, I can only assume that was done because there's probably a fealty to IACI, among others. There are corporate lobbyists and there are corporate players who expect, Senator Winder to do the right thing. And you're already seeing some of the IACI picks, starting to line up. Well, I want to be president pro tem. It'd be very interesting to see how that plays out. But listen to this. Scott Herndon says, look, my loss is temporary, which I think, to his credit. Maybe he's not going to be a career politician. Wouldn't that be a relief? His challenger, Jim Woodward, will have a challenger in 2 years and also will have strict scrutiny on his record. And this is the important thing. Woodward owes his win to the Democrat crossovers. But will he appease them to keep their support? The easiest way to tell will be to watch Woodward's actions through how he votes and how he legislates as to whether or not he is a person of principle or he's just, catering to the people who gamed the system to help get him into office. So why do we even care? Why do we even participate? If politics is so dirty, I ask myself this often because it really seems to me sometimes it's just about whether the spears are pointed this way at them or that way at us. And that doesn't seem like any great advance since roughly Bronze Age kind of thinking. Brian Ullman, writing for the Gem State Chronicle, though, does a very good job of breaking down how it's not just a debate, okay? This is not just a popularity contest. In many ways, politics resembles war, and he's not trying to be hyperbolic here. He says, if you want to see it through and see your candidate win, you have got to strategize. You've got to have a certain degree of ruthlessness. Never does he advise them to abandon principle, But he does advise that you're going to have to be in the trenches. You're going to have to get dirty. And I mean that in the sense of get into the fight and probably get bloodied in the process. There's just no other way. If you're not willing to suffer for that, you're not going to succeed. And people who started their campaigns too late found this out the hard way. Now, Brian says, of course, we must never forget why we do what we do. And this is one of the great ways to sift the principled from the so-called pragmatic who are just there as opportunists and privilege seekers. He says, the strategy is the how, but our principles are the why we do what we do. We want to keep Idaho a safe and free place for our children and grandchildren to enjoy. The political process is a tool toward that goal, not an end unto itself. And it's easy to get sucked into this strategy and forget why we're here. But the purpose of politics is to win elections so that we have the ability to implement policies that protect our liberties. How do they do that? By limiting government. And to accomplish that, he says, we need good candidates who understand how to win. Otherwise, we're just playing. I'm torn between admiration and he said it very well. I want to argue against him, but I really can't. This is kind of a pragmatic take, but I know it's coming from a principled person. So I think he said it very well. It's not something you want to outsource to somebody else. And by the way, if principles do matter to you more than simply power, well, here's what you look like to those who seek power. Oh, you just want to be free to make your own decisions and not have government telling you what to do. You don't want someone else to make as many decisions for you as possible. Well, then you, of course, are some kind of an extremist. Isn't that crazy? But, a picture like this would be triggering to people. Don't believe me? Ask the Kansas City place kicker. What was his name? Harrison Butker. He's facing all kinds of stress and denouncement for simply saying something that was absolutely self-evidently true even a generation ago. And by the way, what does it look like? Okay, so the right actually had a fairly good showing in the primary. How can the left push back? Well, here's one way. Look at this. The Donnelly Public Library is announcing a closure to children, citing, nice misspell of citing, but thank you, KTVB, Idaho's legislature's library bill. Officials stated because of the ambiguous language of HB 710, the library cannot make an adult section out of range of children because the building is too small. So what they're telling us here is books, which are essentially how-to books, complete with illustrations on how to have transsexual sex, how to have homosexual sex, how to explore your own sexuality through masturbation and all kinds of freakiness, deviant behavior. It's a how-to guide, and also introducing not a small amount of confusion to these kids. That's just something we can't possibly keep that out of the library. What would people think? We're being less than inclusive. I actually saw one librarian making the comment, well, because of the way that this law is worded, we'll have to take books like To Kill a Mockingbird out because it talks about rape. Really? You're going to go there with that kind of false equivalence? Do you really think people aren't smart enough to recognize that a fictional story in which rape is a part of the plot line, but it's not the central theme, it's not teaching kids how to rape, that's comparable to books that are teaching them how to perform various sexual acts, particularly deviant acts that go well beyond what is normally found within nature. Yeah, not going to buy it. This looks a lot more like a tantrum and less like a principled move on the part of these librarians. And actually, I like the way that one Twitter aficionado put it. You can't manage a kids section. They just want to make families suffer for laws that are passed to protect kiddos. Laws that they don't agree with. The library board in Donnelly should be fired and replaced. I expect you're going to see more protests like this, and it's probably going to ramp up. But don't we have Pride Month just around the corner too? Yeah, probably see some things much like this, just to show how unreasonable it is that people would be willing to establish boundaries and say no. They'll tell you that's extremist behavior and it's using government for all the wrong reasons, but it wouldn't be a political issue if they hadn't brought drag queen story hour and perverted books into the reach of kids in the first place. Nobody seems to want to talk about that. Okay, here's an example of some of the mask wearing. Here's the mask slipping. Dan Gukin, I actually was seriously concerned for this guy. He's been very quiet on Twitter, and I hope that he's getting the calming decompression that he needs, because wow, he was wound up tighter than a watch spring going into the primary. But he's specifically speaking to those who are going to pretend to be Republicans for the primary. His number one goal was to unseat Brent Regan in the Kootenai County Republican Central Committee. He wanted to make sure that we could get all the the precinct committeemen out of there as possible and get people in there that he could reliably control. So Dan says, I bid welcome to all the independents / unaffiliated who registered Republican today. Now, that includes a lot of Democrats and who knows, perhaps others in parties yet to be named. But be prepared to be called a rhino / Democrat / woke liberal, and worse, by your pals in the former KCRCC and their authoritarian white Christian nationalist stooges. I mean, that you want to talk about just some name-calling vomit. Blop, there it is. Thank you, Dan. And this is a good way, by the way, to recognize when you're dealing with people who are not necessarily being straight with you. Okay, Dan's mask is, well, there's horrible people out there. What does he call them? The authoritarian white Christian nationalist stooges. We know for a fact that Dan is against whatever that mishmash of words is supposed to mean. He never really defines it. So we're dealing with an unspecified predicate, at least as to who they are, what exactly are their goals. It's just a lot of name calling. But of course, Dan is not telling us exactly what it means, and he's telling us more of what he's against than what he stands for. What does Dan Gukin stand for? I don't know. Power is clearly one of the things on his agenda, but beyond that, I can't see what exactly he stands for. His principles are never clear, and that's a very strong red flag as to whether or not to support a particular group or a particular candidate. When they can tell you everything that they're against and everyone they're against, but they can't tell you what they stand for, that's enemy-driven thinking. That does not make for good governance. Probably best to look for someone who can give you their principles. Russell Mann, same kind of thing. Although Russ, I got to admit, Russ does this in kind of a gentle, passive-aggressive way. Well, I guess it's time to get back to X and keep exposing the no good, terrible, very bad behavior of people who are leading our community into dark places. Okay, Russ. Exhibit A, my opponent, here's the passive-aggressive part, congrats to him on his win, cavorting with Jew hater Dave Riley. Wow. Guilt by association fallacy and, again, more name-calling mixed with a little passive aggression. But what exactly do you stand for, Russ? Hard to tell, because all I'm really sure is he's against this person or against that person and wishes that everyone would chant in unison. And if you do not share his outrage, well, then you are tacitly endorsing whatever it is that he's against. Okay, in the grown-up world, it doesn't work that way. But, when you're given a false dilemma, apparently that's how some people tend to think. Now, I did enjoy this exchange, which was, some of the buzzwords which are used to push this masked approach to how can we take over government without looking like we're just after power. And you'll hear words like bipartisan, which the redheaded libertarian says, that's how you say uniparty in newspeak. And Lauren, I got to give you another shout out here. You were in fine form in this discussion. This Idaho campaign, we also heard words like moderate, old guard, and native. You're getting quite creative. Oh, almost forgot, common sense. And Idaho Sue's pointed this one out too. And don't forget reasonable. Jim Jones would also add the word pragmatic. But again, when you have to have that qualifier, if they can't just tell you what is the principle on which you stand, if you have to have a common sense, I'm a common sense, native, old guard, moderate, reasonable person, it's kind of along the lines of a used car salesman who prefaces, his name with, I'm Honest Joe. I have to tell you I'm honest because you need to know how honest I am. Did I tell you I'm an honest guy? Because I'm an honest guy. Okay, if they have to tell you, there's probably a reason to doubt. By the way, another good example of double speak. This one caught by Brian Allman. Tom Luna said, Idaho is not for sale. This was his press conference just prior to this week's primary. Even as Tom Luna spent six figures to buy precinct committeeman races throughout the state. And here's a good rule of thumb for you. Mailers and text from groups like Gem State Conservatives or elderly former governors are a good sign not to vote for those candidates. Not because they're bad people, but because they're representing power. The structure that wishes to stay in power and which, thankfully, a good number of Idahoans said, nah, not going to play that. By the way, Lauren also brought up, it's interesting to see the Idaho establishment playbook that was used a couple of years ago, now starting to circle the nation in this cycle. Step one, run a trans Republican, someone who ostensibly passes as Republican, but isn't really, or at least doesn't uphold Republican principles. Step two, get all leftists to register Republican. Step three, get a majority vote for the swamp pick and thwart the conservative. And as we're facing in Idaho, if that fails, you shove ranked choice voting down their throats. And you will be seeing a lot about ranked choice voting in the days ahead. Oh, by the way, I'm going to share this one just to trigger those who really need to be triggered, because for some reason this is terribly upsetting. You've heard of the Greater Idaho Project, and 13th County in Eastern Oregon has added its vote to yes, we would like to become a part of Greater Idaho and not be a part of whatever Oregon is on its way to becoming. Why would they do that? We'll talk about that in a moment, but I had to look at this Giga Idaho. Oh man, you know what brings them here? It's really something very simple. These are people who recognize that there is still a place where freedom matters, or at least there are people to whom freedom matters. That doesn't mean we all march in lockstep and we all chant in unison and we all hate the same people and we all like the same things. It's people who understand the principles and the practices upon which freedom is predicated, which means there are things you're going to have to accept that you probably don't really agree with. But acceptance without conformity is one of the essential parts of freedom. And the power seekers and the privilege seekers seem to lose sight of this. So I would welcome anyone who loves freedom. If you are a person who understands we don't have to agree that freedom is the better way, and anything peaceable should be on the table as far as, well, what should people be allowed to do? I don't want to run your life. I don't want to make your decisions for you. And I would expect you should not be running my life either. So if you can meet me on that middle ground, I say welcome. We'd love to have your numbers. We'd love to have your influence. And we can all enjoy freedom the way it's supposed to be enjoyed, minus that incredible power-seeking oversight by those who know best. Yeah, that's central planning. And it always has been and always will be a feature of socialism, collectivism, communism, whatever ism you want to call it. I'll take freedom. Thank you very much. I'm Brian Hyde, and this is Nowhere to Hide.
A press club or bias all media, newspaper, radio.
To be completely blunt here, Brian, and there are plans to expand
indoctrination.
That's right.
Idahoans are also concerned.
Horror shot. That line would be moving a little bit farther west.
I'm like crying.
Nobody wants to see
Dark money is influencing policy in our state.
Well,